So I'm Leslie Johnson and I work for Nebraska Extension. So I'm going to talk to you today about soil texture and water infiltration. So first of all, this demonstration was originally designed for fourth graders. So I think it can be used for any age group, but it's definitely targeted towards youth. So it's very visual and it has a lot of like moving parts per se. So if I was going to do this with the youth, I would first start out by taking this sand or this soil bucket here and showing them the three different types of soils that I have. I like to use a loaded question like which one of these is soil, and usually they'll say not this one, it's sand, but they're all obviously soil. So this is a sand. This is from actually our neighbor's field. It was flooded and eroded onto our land, and so that came from the neighbor's field. This is what I say is from our dirt pile at home. This is what we would pack our feedlots with after we've hauled manure out and we took some soil with it. So to replenish our feedlot, this is a really good clay. And then this one is also came on from the floods and is more silt than anything else. And we have no idea where it might have came from because it could have traveled in those floods for a very long time. It's also fun to have a little bit of mud around. One of the more advanced things that you can do with them is to ribbon soil to find out that texture, which is a lot more, like I said, a lot more advanced than you would use for fourth graders. If I were to get particularly this clay soil wet to where you can't squeeze out any moisture, then you squeeze it between your thumb and finger, and there's lots of other videos that show that, how to do that. But if you squeeze it between your fingers and thumb, it will create a ribbon, and the longer that ribbon is, the more clay is in that soil. And so the mud allows them to do that kind of thing. So that's fun to get dirty with that. So once I've had the kids all busy and had a lot of interaction with them and getting their hands dirty, then I would go in to tell them that, well, it really was, they're all different kinds of soil. They're not sand, silt, and clay is the three different soil particles, and these are just examples of those things. And then I would talk a little bit about how sand is the largest particle, and it's something that you can see with your own eyes. So I would take and actually grab a handful of sand and show them that they can actually see the particle size there. And then silt is the next size smaller, and it requires a microscope to see that. And then clay actually requires an electron microscope. And so when I'm describing that to kids, I would say something along the lines of it's a super powerful microscope that most people aren't going to find on a regular basis. And so you would have to go to a very scientific lab to find that. So then I would go into the fact that loam soils have all three different particle sizes, and talk with them about how a little bit about the soil texture triangle. So the soil texture triangle is essentially the clay is at the top, the sand is over here, and the silt is over here. And if you were at any point of the triangle, you'd be 100% of that particle type. Most soils don't have 100% of any one particle type, and so they're somewhere in the middle. So at that blend, they have different kinds of soils. So this one is a silty loam, meaning it has some clay and in it, or a silty clay. This is probably more like a silty clay, or a clay, more clay than silt. And then this is more of a sand, and I would call it, I'd say it's probably more sand than anything. It's probably as close to 100% sand. When I'm using this with kids, I don't spend a lot of time on the soil texture triangle because it's a lot of information for fourth graders to absorb. So that would be all I would cover with the soil triangle with them. If you were using it with adults, you might be able to go a little bit more in depth and talk about some of the different categories, but I wouldn't do that with younger children. So once I've talked about that, so loam is kind of somewhere in the middle. It has all three particles and it's more in the middle, and so that's about the only thing that I would say about loam. Then I would talk a little bit about the space between the particles, which we call pore size. And usually when I talk with kids about it, I'll explain what pore size is and that these are soil pores, and that's where the water actually goes into the soil. And when I do it, I ask them to repeat back to me what a pore is, like tell them, repeat pore, and then ask them what that is, and then they would have to tell me just to interact with them more so. And hopefully that they're retaining some of the information that I'm talking about. And then we would talk about how the different particle sizes have different pore sizes. To describe that, I like to use these artist brushes, and I usually hand them out to look at, and you can see the different artist brushes are actually natural sponges, and so they have different sizes pores. And so we like to use the analogy that those are kind of like chunks of soil that have different size pores. So this one might be, it's got really large pores, it might be more like a sandy soil. This one has got really tiny pores, and so it might be more like a clay soil. When kids are using these, a lot of times they will, because they're kids, they just squish them and squeeze them because they're soft, and so they will smash them to smithereens. The good news is, while they're probably one of the more expensive parts of this demonstration, when you put them in a bucket of water and let them sit, they swell back up, and then you can let them air dry, and they are just as good as new. So it's not something that you have to replace all the time. So that's those. So then the next thing I would talk about would be these three types of sponges. And these three types of sponges I chose to represent different soils. This is just a scouring pad, and a lot of times I'll hold it up to the light and you can kind of see through it. That shows that there is larger pore spaces, and so the water is going to go in quicker than it will for some of the others. This is what I use for a clay. This is a foam sponge. It's got really tiny pores. I always use a dry sponge, and I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But I always use a dry sponge, and these are really tiny pores, so it's more like a clay soil than anything else. I don't have a good example of a silt soil, but I do use just your standard kitchen sponge, again dry, because it has a lot of different size pores in it. So it's got big ones and small ones, and so it's a lot more like a loamy soil would be. So then I would take, and I'm just using colored water, and I have a stash of colored water here with this, but it doesn't really matter what you use. I like to use the spigot just because it's handy. But I have also a measuring cup. This has just got food coloring in it. Iced tea works really good. It doesn't stain your hands as bad. I've done this a few times tonight, and so I have very yellow hands from the food coloring. And I also use a baby bottle. There's some other ideas out there, but I like the baby bottle because it allows me to measure the amount of water that I'm putting on, because I want to put the same amount of water through those every single time. And so I use 8 ounces, and you'll see in a minute why I do that. And I just have the tip cut off of the baby bottle. So I start with the sand, and I ask the kids, what do they think is going to happen? And most of the time they've gotten by now figured out that it's going to run right through the sand. And so I'll pour on the 8 ounces and talk through that whole 8 ounces of various different things related to soil. Maybe ask them what they think is going to happen to the next one, or what's happening currently, that kind of thing. So I've poured 8 ounces through there. I'll pour another 8 ounces into my baby bottle, as long as I don't dump it. And again, back on with the baby bottle cut off. I'll do the clay next. And the reason I do the dry sponge for clay is, you see, I can talk a little bit about ponding and why a dry clay soil doesn't infiltrate very well, because those pores are so small that the water actually is repelled by those small particles that can't get into the soil as quickly. If you were to use a wet sponge, it would infiltrate faster, but this allows for a greater effect by using the dry sponge, and you can talk about runoff that way too, because if you've ever watered something, even a plant that's been really dried out, your house plant that's been really dried out, the water will run right through because it went through the cracks on the outside of the pot. Same thing, it's been too dry and so that it can't take up that water. So I like to be able to talk about that. Again, with refilling. And then with the loamy sponge, I'm going to pour it through. I get a little bit of runoff on it because it's dry, but you'll notice that it takes a lot longer before the water starts to flow through the sponge. The kids really pick up on that pretty quickly, that it didn't go through as fast. They'll also notice that the sponge expands. I don't have a lot to say about that, but they do. The kids do notice that, and it's a really cool effect for them. So we've talked about how water has gone down. We've talked about how it has run off in some cases. And then I have a funnel here, and I'll squeeze this in here. I missed a little bit, but you can see the sand holds some water, so it didn't all run through. And I'll squeeze the clay out. It really ran off on this one, so barely any water got into that soil for the clay. You can barely see, there's just a little bit in there. And then for the loam, and this is where I always use 8 ounces. This is where it's really important, because when you start squeezing that loam soil out, the water actually runs over. And so the kids think that's a really awesome effect, because there's such a drastic difference between the different soils. And so the kids really pick up on that. If you use less than 8 ounces of water, I don't think you'd get it to run over. It would fill up to the top, but it's really cool that it runs over. And that's why I use the 8 ounces. I could show you quickly. Now this sponge is a little wet. Let me pour 8 ounces through that. Maybe. So the water goes right in then instead of running off. And so that's why I like to talk about it when it's dry first. That way I can talk about runoff. The thing that's kind of cool with this, I'm still getting a little bit of runoff because of the pore size being so small. But the cool thing about that is that the clay, assuming the demonstration worked properly, will actually hold more water than the loam soil will. It'll also overfill. It ran off a little more than it probably should have, but it did go quite a bit different. It wouldn't be nearly the effect if you did that. So that's why the dry soil or the dry sponge is really important. I like this demonstration because it shows some of the very basic soil texture things. It may not be your standard soil health type demonstration because it is so basic soils. Soil texture definitely affects some of the other soil health components. So if you don't know anything about soil texture, it could really affect what your thoughts on soil health are, because soil health in a sandy soil is going to look very different than soil health in a clay soil or a silty loam soil.